Let's welcome him with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين، ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، حبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين، لا سيما بقية الله في الأرضين. روحي وأرواحنا لتراب مقدم الفداء، فقد قال الله في كتابه المجيد: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. إن الصلاة تنهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر ولذكر الله أكبر والله يعلم ما تصنعون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. These are another salawat. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. For the hastening of the reappearance of our Imam, please recite a louder salawat. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجه. Yesterday we had started a conversation, a discussion on the topic of friendship and the proper way and characteristics that a friend should have, and the interaction that should exist between friends. Now, what we had mentioned was that the central idea, the most important idea in that relationship is that the friendship should be based on Iman, based on this belief system within Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if that does not exist, if that's not something that's binding the people together, then there are certain problems that will naturally occur. The least of, or the first of which is probably the most important as well, is that it'll create a certain level of apathy and disinterest within religion. A idea that what religion you have is not that important. Because obviously you have a close relationship with someone who is following a different religion. And because of that close relationship, your heart is inclined towards them. It's difficult if your heart is inclined towards someone to think badly of them on their choices and what they believe in. And so naturally, you'll tend to slowly start to think that, that religion isn't that big of a deal, that not having Islam is not that big of a deal. And so that's why we have to be careful about who we are friends with, because it has that effect on each other. We even have hadith to the effect of saying that al-mar'u ala dina khalili, right? That a man or humanity is on the religion of his close friend. If you look at the close friend, yes, that's the religion that a person has. And that's something that we probably experience within our own lives. The shifts in our attitudes and our perspectives, if we think back on them, we can trace them back to who we surrounded ourselves with during any point in time within our lives. I'm not saying that's the only factor and that is completely dependent on the environment, but it has a very, very large impact on us. Now, that being said, does that mean that if someone is not a Muslim, or if we have a friend that's not a Muslim, that we have to cut ties off from them and reject them and push them to the side? No, I'm not saying that either. But it's almost like a natural thing that there will be a distance that's created between us. If the most important thing to me in this world is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and traveling towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then someone next to me doesn't agree with that, doesn't have that mindset, then naturally there will be some big barrier between us. We won't be on the same wavelength of thinking, we wouldn't be acting in the same way, we wouldn't be reacting in the same way, we wouldn't be aiming for the same things in life. There'll be decisions that I make that would be completely not understandable by that other person, right? And there'll be the same thing the other way around. So naturally, there'll be a distance that will be created. There should be a distance that's created. Again, that distance doesn't mean that you have to reject them. It's an organic thing that happens naturally. If that doesn't happen, though, if we see within ourselves that within our relationships that doesn't happen, that the people that we feel closest to and the people that are dearest to us are people who don't share our religion, we have to ask ourselves, why is it that happened? Most probably, we'll find that if we look into ourselves, we'll find that religion isn't the most important thing to us. That it's not a defining characteristic of myself. Because if it were, it wouldn't happen in that way. Naturally, it wouldn't happen. To put it in another way, if religion and going towards Islam was the most important thing to me, if I really think that the next world is where the real life is, everything in this world is to set up the next world, all of those things, if I actually believed in that, then I had a friend next to me that I care about that doesn't believe in Islam, then my primary objective in that friendship should be to make them a Muslim, to convince them to become a Muslim. Because according to me, what I believe in, that's what actual success is. That's what everything in this life is for. And so if I see someone who's not a Muslim, who I care about, well, then I should care for them in the sense that I want them to be better. I want them to get what's best for them as well. That would be Islam as well. And so if I see within myself that in my relationships with non-Muslims who I call my friends, I don't have this within myself that I want them to be a Muslim, then there's something wrong. There's something very wrong in that relationship. Because either I don't think of Islam as that important, or I don't care for them. It can't be, there's no real third option there. And so if we look at our friendships and our relationships, it's a very good litmus test to see how much we actually care about our religion. Because it's something that naturally comes out. It's not something that's like forced and that can be sort of structured artificially. Right? Like salat, prayer, saum, all these things, there are things that are outward expressions. As maybe we can even trick ourselves into doing them. Right? We can push ourselves to doing them because the people around us are doing them. But friendships are things that are much more difficult to fake in that sense. We ourselves know when we are not close to someone, when we don't feel close to someone. And so if we look at those relationships where we do feel close to the people, then it's a very good litmus test for our own sense of how much we actually care about our own religion. Now, we've talked many days regarding how to overcome the barriers and the obstacles that force us away from an Islamic sense of success, in which we talked about the ego and materialism and all these things. Yesterday we mentioned as well a brief amount about social media. I'll mention a brief aspect of that as well. Not specific to social media, but social media is where it comes out maybe the most obvious. And that's a perspective of looking at the world in a very quantified way, looking at the world in terms of numbers. Okay. Social media very easily pushes one to look in the world in that way. Right? The number of likes that someone got, the number of retweets, the number of followers, the number of friends, the number of views, everything became about numbers. How we are quantifying the goodness or the sort of the effect of something strictly based on the numbers. Not to say that numbers are not important. No, numbers are important. But there's fundamentally things that are more important than numbers. We have for example, in our hadith, or for example, this is in the wasiyah of Imam Hussein to his son that he gives in Karbala, and to Imam Zain al-Abidin, says that don't it's also a saying of Imam alayhi salam as well. It says, don't sort of be distraught or dissuade from the path of the truth, even if there are few numbers, even if the numbers are few. وَإِن قَلَّ نَفَرًا, even if the numbers are very few. Now, this is something that we see repeated time and time again throughout the Quran. That it talks about how the people who are truly accepting reality and what's right are always few in number. And the ones that are going against the path of the truth are most often large in number. They're the majority for one reason or another. And so numbers are not what it's all about. It's not about a quantitative understanding of success. It's qualitative. It's about what is being achieved, about how, in the manner that things are being done. So that's something also that is sometimes, or very often, a barrier to how we see things. A more subtle example of this and how it can become a barrier to our progress is the perspective that we might sort of develop by our studies and by our occupations. One of the very obvious places where there is a contradiction between Western academia and Islamic perspective is the study of humanity, right? The study of humans. The very obvious part of that is psychology. For the very obvious reason that we believe that there's a soul. And in Western academia, obviously, there isn't going to be a thing called a soul, right? At least not in academia. It's not going to be looked at in that perspective. The human will be looked at as a body, a material being, right? Whereas we're looking at it as both a material aspect and an immaterial aspect. Now, from that conflict, right, between those two perspectives, you'll see that there'll be very vastly different directions that people will take in how to understand the human, how to fix issues, how to fix, for example, depression and all of these things that come from that. Now, I'm not saying that it's completely worthless and that there's nothing good to be found within Western academia, even in regarding this. No, there might be things that can be used. There might be studies that can be used. But everything, even the things that seem innocuous, are questionable and need to be sort of examined very carefully to see whether or not they're being directed in the proper direction or not. I don't want to talk about that too much. I wanted to talk about more subtle thing. That's in psychology. But a more subtle thing, but a more impactful thing is in the hard sciences. The physics, the chemistry, the biology. It's in these fields. In these fields, you'll see that the way that you are encouraged to look at the world is strictly through your senses, strictly through tangible ramifications and observable events. That's how you're encouraged to see the world. If you can observe it, it exists. If you can't observe it, it doesn't exist. And it's such a overwhelming emphasis on how to see the world that despite, you might think that, okay, these fields naturally lend themselves to coming closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because you're seeing, you're observing the signs of Allah, the creation of Allah in more detail, and so it should push you to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala more. But you see, a lot of times it's the opposite, that the people who go more and more into these fields are the ones who reject Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the reason why is that it pushes this idea of looking at the world through numbers, looking at the world through tangible experiences, and nothing else matters. If I can't measure it, it doesn't exist. That's the idea that's behind all of the sciences. Now, we don't have time, and it's probably not the appropriate setting to go over the philosophy of science and to show how, at its base, it's self-contradictory. Right? That science itself is based in the current day, in its philosophy, on a self-contradictory basis, that it cannot explain the basis upon which it itself has been established. I'll give a very, very simple example, but there's much more detail that we can give, and even in this example, it might require more explanation than what I'm giving to understand it fully. But the very, very basic principle that all the sciences are based on is an idea that the whole of the universe, all of it is harmonious, that it all is homogeneous, that the laws exist the same throughout wherever it is, that they're not constantly changing, that the laws of physics, for example, are constant, that right now, whatever they are, they're going to do the same thing the next second, and the next second, and the next second. But that's not something that's measurable. In fact, by nature, it's something that is intangible. Right? The laws of physics are what determine what you can measure. Right? You can't measure the laws themselves. You can't make sure or ensure that the laws are steady and constant. It's an assumption. And so science itself is based on an assumption that it can never prove, right? Not based on any tangible means. Another example of that is the example of causality. Causality is an idea upon which all of the sciences use. There's a cause and effect, and you're measuring all of these things in relationships between things. But the idea of causality, that one thing comes from another thing or is dependent on another thing, is again not measurable, not detectable. No matter how precise machines get, no matter how accurate your calculations are, at most what you measure is that two things happen at the same time, or one thing happened at a time after another thing. But that one thing depends on another thing, that's an assumption. Again, based on a series of other assumptions. And so we see that science itself is based on immeasurable, intangible assumptions. I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm just saying that this idea that therefore you can't see the world through intangible means. Well, if I were to accept that, then I couldn't accept any of science either. And so we see that, again, it's an interesting topic and maybe something for some other time, some other setting. But you see that itself is something that's self-contradictory. Now, all of these things that we talked about the barriers towards success, the barriers towards us understanding and seeing the world for how it truly is, and moving towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We also want to talk a little bit on the other side of the coin, which is what allows us to move faster and quicker towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, we've talked about that somewhat in terms of these structures that we talked about. We said that how they allow us to break past these barriers. But I want to talk about something a bit more sort of positive, in the sense that it's something that is in the perspective of it being a vehicle for us getting closer towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And before we get to that, just as a reminder, we've defined success in the Islamic sense as reaching proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like becoming close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the reason why is not something arbitrary, not something that is, just randomly we're choosing that as a word and as a concept to apply, but rather because we've we've proven, inshallah, to ourselves that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the source of everything, the source of all perfection, the source of all good. And so by nature, right, by how it is, if I'm closer to Allah, then I'm closer to all that is good. If I'm closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then I'm closer to the source of everything. And if I'm further away from Allah, then I'm further from what is all that is good. And by nature that would mean bad on the flip side. And so it's not something arbitrary or something that we've randomly chosen. It's something that is provable in that sense. But how do we see and how do we test and know if I am in line or going closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That's the whole test of this world. That's what we're being tested with. And it's simply by seeing if our will is in harmony with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will is. His will is the superior will that overlays all of the cosmos, everything. And He's explained and given it to us. He's said to us what He wants from us. All of the wajibat, avoiding the haram. If our will is in harmony with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will, then we see that we're going closer. If we see that we're not in harmony, that I'm doing sin, that whatever the sin is, I'm repeating, and each sin is a moment of turning my back from Allah, going further away. So that is the ultimate way of seeing whether or not I'm getting closer or further. Right? And then again, don't have the actual time to go into this in detail, but our will and the reason why we do things is another important part of what we're doing. It's not a separate part. It's not something separate from the actions. Our intentions are critically and crucially important to our actions. Even though we don't have time, I'll actually go. Because it's a beautiful series of verses that I've briefly quoted one part of it once in one of the nights, but quoted in more detail now, inshallah. There's a series of verses in Surah Baqarah that talk about charity. And it's very, very beautiful because they're metaphor after metaphor after metaphor. Well, you're going to go to the end of it, or the last two verses of it. One is verse 264. It says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تبطلوا صدقاتكم بالمن والأذى كالذي ينفق ماله رئاء الناس ولا يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر. It says, O you who believe, O you who have iman, don't make void your giving of charity بالمن والأذى, by doing, English doesn't have a good translation for this. Farsi is much better because it uses the Arabic word. It says don't do minnet guzari. Don't make people feel obliged. Don't go after them the next day and say, oh hey, remember how I gave you $10 when you needed it? Don't keep on doing that, making them feel indebted to you. Wal adha, and don't bother them. Right? Don't do that. It says if you do that, who are you like? It says كَالَّذِي يُنْفِقُ مَالَهُ رِئَاءَ النَّاسِ. You'll become like the people who gave their wealth, who spent their wealth, but رِئَاءَ النَّاسِ, to do riyā, to show off in front of people. وَلَا يُؤْمِنُ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ. And they don't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the last day. Now it gives a metaphor, what this action is like. This is where we'll see and then we'll come to a different metaphor and we'll compare the two. It says, فَمَثَلُهُ, the parable of this, the similitude of this, كَمَثَلَ صَفْوَانٍ عَلَيْهِ تُرَابٌ. It's like a flat stone upon which there's a layer of dirt. فَأَصَابَهُ وَابِلٌ. And then their downpour comes. Now when there's dirt and there's rain, the desire, the expectation is that you want things to grow. Right? But because this dirt is on this very flat and hard stone, the rain, instead of making things grow, it says, فَتَرَكَهُ صَلْدًا. It wipes the stone clean. It just wipes the dirt away instead of making the dirt grow. Things grow from the dirt. Now on the other side, I'm going to skip the rest of the verse. The next verse, it says, وَمَثَلُ الَّذِينَ يُنْفِقُونَ أَمْوَالَهُمْ ابْتِغَاءَ مَرْضَاتِ اللَّهِ وَتَثْبِيتٌ لِأَنفُسِهِم مِنْ أَنفُسِهِم. It says the parable of the ones who give their wealth seeking the pleasure of Allah, وَتَثْبِيتًا مِنْ أَنفُسِهِم. Not just they started out with seeking the pleasure of Allah, but in the future they keep that intent. Right? Because if you compare the previous people, they were the believers, they weren't the disbelievers. So they gave the wealth for a right reason, but then they made it void. They made it void by their actions afterwards. Right? So they started off with a good intent, but that same action that they did with a good intention, because of wrong actions later on, they made it void. This group, the opposite, they start off with good intentions and they keep the good intention. They تَثْبِيتًا مِنْ أَنفُسِهِم. What is their similitude? كَمَثَلَ جَنَّةٍ بِرَبْوَةٍ. It's like a garden in a high place. أَصَابُهُ وَابِلٌ فَأَتَى أَكَلَهَا ضِعْفَيْنِ. If a downpour comes, then the vegetation, the growth is multitudes greater than it would be normally. Because it's at a high place, it collects the water. فَإِن لَمْ يُصِبْهَا وَابِلٌ فَطَلْ. Even if a downpour doesn't come, even if it's just a drizzle of rain, it still grows. Now what's the comparison between the two? What's the heart of it? We see that the actual difference maker on whether or not the action, what we consider that outward form of giving charity had a good effect or not was the intent, was why it was done and how it was treated afterwards. Right? Did that intent keep the same or did it change? That means that if I do a large amount of charity, if I'm the Bill Gates and I give $1 billion, right, more than $1 billion, probably more money than all of us collectively have together or maybe even ever have throughout all of our lifetimes. If all of that money he gave for charity, but he's an atheist, right? And again, not judging him as a person, it was an example, right? Let's pretend it's like this random atheist, right? Who doesn't believe in God, and he had every opportunity to turn to God, right? Every opportunity. So again, we're not talking specifically about Bill Gates. Who knows about him? Random billionaire, right? Gave $1 billion to charity, but he's purely, a materialist. Has no intent for anything for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he had every opportunity to acknowledge Allah, become a Muslim and everything. He was given opportunity after opportunity, but he rejected. So he's a knowing kafir. In that case, all of that charity doesn't benefit that person in the slightest. Maybe out of God's infinite mercy, might give him some reward in this world, right? Some sort of benefit in this world. But lasting, effective change, difference, it's not there. This is based on the intent, what was being sought. This is something, again, like if you look at it in a microcosm, we naturally agree to this kind of thing. If I go and I see that someone is giving charity, but I know that the pure reason for them doing it is that they want to collect votes after which to use a specific position of political power to then go and oppress the same people that they took charity from. They gave charity to. Then we don't say that them giving charity was a good thing. Right? Naturally, we say that it was a bad thing. It was a bad thing because it's based on the intent. So anyway, that whole long sort of example was to show this idea that the intent is extremely important. And it's a fundamental part of our actions. It's not even a separate thing from action, it's an internal action. And that is something that fuels everything that we have. Now we have an action in Islam that's prescribed to us that we have to do that exemplifies this and nurtures this intent. And that's the action of salat. If we look at salat as a structure, it is something that we're commanded to do, told to do 5 times a day. But what it does, the effects it has, is something tremendous. We have the verse that I recited in the beginning. Inna salata tanha 'anil fahsha'i wal munkar. That certainly salat, prayer, forbids bad deeds or corruption and bad deeds. Now this action of forbidding, people might say, well, I know several people who pray and they still do several bad things. Right? They do a lot of bad things. And this is why, again, we see that the words of the Quran are very careful. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is wise in His picking of words, and we also have to be wise in listening as well. It doesn't say that salat makes someone not do good deeds. It says salat forbids it. It's like a voice that's saying, don't do this. Right? Because we have in other places in the Quran, for example, we have that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does nahi of fahsha and munkar as well. Obviously, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is much greater than any prayer, but we see that still people do bad deeds. So it's not the case of saying that it's something that prohibits bad deeds and actions from happening. It's something that's forbidding it in the sense of saying, don't do this, don't do this. It's like it's inculcating within ourselves an inner voice, an inner conscience that's telling us, hey, look, pay attention to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Pay attention to your master. Pay attention to your Lord. Pay attention to what really matters. Pay attention to the day of judgment. Pay attention to that this world isn't all that there is. That there is going to be a death, a final day, in which you're going to have to be held accountable for all of your actions. It's training that inner voice. And all of that training goes back to this attention towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is why the heart of prayer, to the extent of even being a crucial point in a condition for the validity of prayer, is our intent, why we're doing it. We have to be doing it qurbatan ilallah. If I do it riya and nas, to show off, then I have to repeat my prayer. It doesn't count. I have to be doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so if I'm not having that intent, it's as if I'm not even praying. But even if I do, if I pray with that proper intent, does it mean that magically everything, all my actions will become good? No. It's that inner voice, but I can ignore that inner voice, unfortunately. Right? I can very easily ignore my conscience. But how can we foster it? How can we train in ourselves, train and support that inner voice to become bigger? One of the most important things that we can do is train ourselves in the etiquettes of praying. Sometimes, right, in the way that we imagine the way that the world would work, is that we would have an idea of the importance of things and then treat them important. So we would know them to be important and then treat them to be important because of how we know. It would follow them, like a logical sort of thing. But sometimes we need to do the opposite. We might very vaguely understand that something is important because God said so, but we don't truly believe in it. In order to get to a state where our hearts soften enough to be able to understand their importance, sometimes we need to start treating it as important first, and then we'll understand the importance. So how do we treat salah, prayer, as important? The first thing is that we pray on time. Right? We keep to the prayer times. Right? Awwal al-waqt, the first time when the adhan is there, that's when we want to pray. Obviously there's exceptions, especially in Shahr Ramadan, people are hungry. I'm not saying you have to pray Maghrib and Isha right at the time of adhan. I'm not saying that at all. Especially in a community when there's not just concerns of the individual, you have to be concerned about everyone. And obviously you can delay for a few minutes and things to break fast and then start praying. But in general, our outlook should be that we want to pray on time, the first time that it becomes available. What else? The act of wudu. The act of wudu is also an act of ibadah. To this extent, again, if I do it mindlessly, without intent, then it not only is it not accepted by Allah, it's also that's void. I have to redo my wudu. It doesn't count. It's a condition for its validity. So I need to treat it like that as well. I need to treat my act of wudu as an act of trying to get closer to Allah, an act of purifying myself from everything that I've dirtied myself with. There's a reason, maybe again, you can't say an ultimate reason, but maybe a wisdom behind the fact that wudu is not actually something that cleans your external body that much. And perhaps the wisdom behind that is that it's emphasizing to us that there's a more fundamental cleanliness that we need to achieve. Obviously, the bodily cleanliness is important, right? And we should be maintaining that as well. That's an etiquette that needs to be done too. But again, that's a different point. What else? The way that we pray. If I realize what I'm doing in my prayer, how I should be praying, who I'm praying to, then I would actually be speaking in my prayer. I would actually be talking. I would be saying what's in my heart. I would come to prayer prepared to plead for something in front of Allah. It would be an actual conversation. It would be something I am actually saying and begging for and actually calling out to God for. But we see so often that I don't even know what I'm saying. Right? Let alone my heart being in it or not. I don't actually even know what I'm saying. And just test ourselves mentally. If I go throughout all of the words that I'm saying in the salah, do I know what they mean? A lot of us don't. That's the first thing. It should be almost something that we naturally would want to do. I'm doing this 5 times a day for however how many years I've been doing it. If I still don't even know what I'm saying, it's kind of embarrassing. It should be embarrassing for ourselves. We should want to know. Yes, again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of His infinite mercy accepts those prayers. Even if it's not a complete prayer, even if it's not on time, even if I didn't do wudu with the right perspective and all of those things. Inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts all of those prayers. But that's not this kind of prayer. That's not the kind of prayer that will forbid evil actions and make me grow as a person. We need to pay attention to it. And it's a beautiful thing that we're obliged to do it. Because it's a favor to us. Having the structure of prayer within our lives is one of the biggest blessings and favors that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to us. So we need to pay it its attention. Now, there's a lot to be talked about prayer. Just wanted to mention the end of the verse, since we started at the beginning. The one that says, إِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ تَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْمُنْكَرِ. It says, وَلَذِكْرَ اللَّهِ أَكْبَرُ. And certainly the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is greater. There's a couple of possibilities of what this could refer to. One of the possibilities, one of the more likely possibilities, is that one of the effects of prayer is the remembrance of Allah. Right? That you remind yourself of Allah. It's a very natural thing because you're speaking to Allah. Right? You're going before Allah. And you'd have to be extremely, completely oblivious to not have at least a moment of remembrance of Allah within prayer. So at the very least, there's this remembrance of Allah. This is وَلَذِكْرُ اللَّهِ أَكْبَرُ. Meaning it's greater. Greater than what? Greater than the forbidding of fahsha and munkar. Greater than the forbidding of evil deeds and wrong actions. Meaning that there's an effect of prayer which is held within the remembrance of Allah, which is even greater than avoiding wrong things. It's the formulation of the self.